This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. To pre-order Kaldheim, click on my referral link in the description below. You can also find referral links for all the singles in this video if you check the description. Hi everyone, I'm Neetzahone, and it's Wednesday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. In today's video, I'm looking at cards that let you pay life for some type of effect. This is something we most often see in Black. After all, their motto is greatness at any cost, and turning your own life energy into some kind of effect is right up Black's alley. That said, not all cards that let you pay life are Black, and we'll see a few on this list that aren't. To qualify for this list, a card simply had to let you pay life for one reason or another, with a few exceptions. I decided not to include Phyrexian mana cards like Ataxian Probe, as I've already done a top 10 on them, and they would have dominated most of this list, and that wouldn't have been very interesting. I also excluded fetch lands and shock lands from the list for similar reasons. Also, I went with a pretty strict definition here. A card had to let you pay life for something. This means cards like Dark Confidant that simply cause you to lose life or get damaged as part of a triggered ability are not included on this list. The two effects are similar and they both frequently appear in Black, but they are mechanically distinct, so I decided to keep them separate. At some point, I will probably do a top 10 on cards that make their controller lose life to look at those cards in particular. Anyway, in all, there were 277 cards that were eligible for this list, and in this video, I'm going to talk about the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A top 8 at a Pro Tour, Players Tour, Mythic Championship, Mythic Invitational, Legacy, or Vintage Championship is worth 2 points, and a top 8 at a Grand Prix or Magic Fest is worth 1 point. Alright, let's get to the list. At number 10, it's Putrid Leech, a creature that lets you pay life to increase its stats, which effectively makes the Leech into a 2-mana 4/4. Paying some life to make this creature crazy efficient is well worth it, and it made Putrid Leech a pretty formidable creature in its time. It felt almost like Tarmogoyf, and that's good company to keep. In both Standard and Extended, it was played in Jund mid-range decks, but it doesn't have any points since 2011, so it's probably not going to be on this list much longer. At number 9, it is Bolos Citadel, the newest card to make the list. The Citadel lets you play cards off the top of your library without paying for them, with mana anyway. Instead, you end up paying life. Not paying mana for cards is incredible, so obviously giving up some life for the Citadel is great. All those extra cards you play can eventually allow you to activate the Citadel's other ability, which allows you to sacrifice 10 non-land permanents to make each opponent lose 10 life. In Standard and Historic, it has primarily been played in sacrifice decks, which are especially interested in using the activated ability, since they tend to run things like Mayhem Devil that will give them the extra damage they need to one-shot people. Bolos' Citadel has also already gained a ton of points in Vintage, where it is the exact kind of thing Storm decks love. These decks try to cast a ton of spells in a single turn and then kill someone with a Storm card like Tendrils of Agony, and obviously enough, the Citadel lets you cast as many cards as you can from the top of your library, provided you have the life for them. The Citadel is going to continue to gain points in Vintage, and perhaps some other formats too, so it may move up this list going forward. At number 8, we have Erebos, God of the Dead, a god that lets you pay life to draw cards. In addition to that, he also keeps your opponent from gaining life, and if your devotion's high enough, he becomes a huge, indestructible creature. While there were lots of devotion decks in Thero Standard, Black was arguably the most powerful of the bunch, thanks to cards like Erebos and Grey Merchant of Asphodel, which hugely incentivized you playing cards with lots of black mana symbols. Grey Merchant also combined well with Erebos because you knew you could pay a ton of life and count on gaining some of it back later with the Merchant. Erebos was also played in some less devotion-centric control decks while it was in Standard. So far, though, he hasn't gained any points outside of Block or Standard. At number 7, it is Unarguables Bloodfast, a double-face card that starts out as an enchantment that lets you pay life to draw cards. If your life gets low enough, it transforms into Temple of Aclazotz, a land that can tap for black mana, and it can also sacrifice creatures and gain you back some life, something you might really be in need of after fasting for too long. The two sides synergize together pretty impressively, as you can be pretty reckless with the fast when you know you'll be getting some of that life back later after it transforms. During its time in Standard, the fast was played primarily in aggro decks. One of the biggest problems for aggro decks is often that they can run out of gas on an opponent who makes the game go long. As a result, lots of aggro decks ran Bloodfast in the sideboard, and it gave them a way to make sure they could keep pressuring their opponent thanks to all of the extra cards. The Fast also has a single Pro Tour top 8 in Pioneer, where it was played in a Dimir Inverter deck. Eventually, the Dimir Inverter deck got banned out of the format, and it isn't currently clear whether or not Unarguables Bloodfast will find a new home in the format. At number 6, it is Necropotence. It lets you pay life to sort of draw cards. It does take a full turn to get that card into your hand, so it is an immediate card draw. Necropotence is a card that was famously underrated by people when it came out, as people just couldn't imagine the downside on the card would be worth it. People quickly realized they were wrong when they started playing with Necropotence. Turns out being able to draw a bunch of cards for no mana is pretty good. Who knew, right? The card was so out of control by 2000 and 2001 that it was banned in Legacy and extended and restricted in Vintage. Necropotence has actually enjoyed a bit of a renaissance lately as Doomsday decks have become top tier in Vintage. These decks generally try to win the game with Thassa's Oracle and Doomsday, and Necropotence can help you out by finding you your Doomsday, and you can also use Necropotence to just get rid of the remaining cards in your library to make the Oracle win a little sooner. Necropotence gained 10 points in 2020, and if it can keep that up, it may continue to move up this list. At number 5, it is Gristlebrand, a demon that lets you pay life to draw a ton of cards. People are often surprised that Gristlebrand doesn't show up higher on MTG top 10s, and that's because in terms of raw power, he is absolutely insane. Not only does he let you pay life to draw cards, he can also gain you life back thanks to lifelink, and that lets you draw even more cards. It's hard to beat Gristlebrand in most cases, even if he is killed right away because of the card advantage. But Gristlebrand's mana cost is no joke, and that means he can really only be played in decks that cheat him into play, really restricting him to a couple decks. Just casting Gristlebrand isn't really an option, but that's okay, because there are lots of formats that look to cheat him into play. It gained a few points in Standard, where it was usually reanimated with Unburial Rites, and a few in Modern, where it was usually done with Goryo's Vengeance. The Eternal formats are where it is easiest to cheat him into play, though. In Legacy, this is often accomplished with Show and Tell, Sneak Attack, and various reanimation spells, and in Vintage, it's also done with Show and Tell as well as Oath of Druids. At number 4, it is Underworld Connections, another card which lets you pay life to draw cards. In this case, you get to make one of your lands gain the ability to tap and allow you to pay life to draw a card. 3 mana for a repeatable source of additional cards is pretty powerful, and is the kind of thing that can just win you the game by attrition over your opponent. Most games, the extra cards you get will let you kill your opponent quickly enough that the life you pay doesn't really matter. That made it a great card for Jund decks while it was in Standard. It was also played in a lot of black Devotion decks, where the 2 black mana symbols in the casting cost brought all kinds of additional value, and it could be played alongside Grey Merchant of Asphodel, making it way less dangerous to draw cards with Underworld Connection. At number 3, we have Deep Analysis, the first non-black card we've seen on this list. It actually has the same score as Underworld Connection, but I gave it the edge based on the fact that it has been played in way more formats and it has more Pro Tour top 8s too. Deep Analysis doesn't let you pay life in any way when you play it from your hand. It's actually a kind of inefficient spell when you cast it that way. However, it does have Flashback, which allows you to pay life and half the mana to cast it, and that's a pretty great deal. Even if you never cast this card from your hand, you were getting a 2-for-1, and lots of decks that utilized it mostly sought to get it into the graveyard and cast it from there, rather than cast it from their hand and then the graveyard. In Block and Standard, it saw play in Madness decks, which could discard it for free with a number of cards and then cast it from the graveyard, on top of whatever value they got for discarding it in the first place. And in Standard and Extended, it saw play in Psychotog control decks, whose eponymous creature could let you discard the card for free for value by increasing his stats, before using it to draw from the graveyard, which would give you more cards to discard to Psychotog. It also used to see play in Legacy Dredge and Oath of Druids decks in Vintage. However, Deep Analysis doesn't have any points since 2018, and the active cards behind it might eventually catch up to it. At number 2, it is Street Wraith. The Wraith itself is a woefully inefficient creature, but his ability to cycle at a cost of no mana is very good. Instead, of course, he's on this list, and that means he lets you pay life. The Wraith is an interesting card to look at in terms of its history, because when it came out, people didn't really play it. It gained 0 points in both Block and Standard, and while it saw a tiny bit of play in Vintage, people kind of just didn't see the point in a card that does almost nothing but cycle. It took the emergence of Living Index for people to realize the Wraith might have potential. That deck was filled with cycling creatures, which it would use to rip through the deck looking for a card to cascade into Living End, at which point the opposing board would blow up and you'd get back the creatures you cycled, like the Wraith. Turns out paying 2 life to draw a card was very nice in that deck, especially because you would reanimate it later on. The Living End deck emerged in Extended and also found success in Modern. That deck really brought Street Wraith to the attention of people for the first time in a long time, and other graveyard decks started to find uses for it. It has also been featured in Modern Death's Shadow, a deck that really likes to lose life, draw cards, and fill the graveyard, and Street Wraith does all of that. While Death's Shadow and Living End decks are by far the decks where the Wraith has done the most in Modern, it's also gained points in Affinity and Hollow One. It's also started to be played in Legacy and Vintage. In the former, it's been played in that format's version of Death's Shadow, as well as Dredge. It's also played in Vintage Dredge decks, as well as the same Doomsday decks that Necropotence has been played in recently. And at number 1, probably not surprising anyone, it's Force of Will. While it only found modest success in Block and Standard, Force of Will was a format-defining card in Extended when it was legal there, and it continues to be one of the key cards in both Legacy and Vintage today. Free counterspells are pretty great, and this is arguably the best free counterspell in the game, and maybe the best counterspell, period. Sure, you have to 2-for-1 yourself and pay a life, and doing those things is a real cost, but not paying mana is huge. This means you can tap out to add to the board, and then still be ready to use your Force of Will when the situation arises. Over the years, Force of Will has been featured pretty exclusively in control decks, which can often minimize the 2-for-1 downside by making sure to draw extra cards. Force of Will continues to gain points at a fairly rapid pace, and that won't be changing anytime soon. There aren't any cards on this list even remotely close to it, so I don't think it will ever lose its spot as the best pay-life card. Well, that does it for this MTG Top 10. If you're interested in paying money as well as life for any of these cards, take a look at the description where I've provided a direct link to each of these cards in the Card Kingdom store. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you stay aware of new MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you need to catch up on the almost 330 MTG Top 10s I've already done, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.